The oppressive quiet of the Chicago steakhouse was a language Alara understood. It spoke in the muted clink of heavy silverware on porcelain, the low murmur of deals being sealed over whiskey, and the nearly silent tread of her own worn shoes on the plush crimson carpet. She moved between tables, a ghost in a crisp black uniform, her exhaustion a carefully guarded secret behind a mask of professional courtesy. For years, she had perfected the art of being invisible, a functional piece of the opulent scenery. But tonight, that invisibility shattered. A brash real estate mogul, his face flushed with arrogance and expensive wine, cornered her by a service station, his voice a blade cutting through the room's decorum. He pointed a thick finger at her hand, mocking the simple, tarnished silver ring she always wore. "What's that piece of junk?" he sneered, his companion laughing cruelly. "I'll give you $1,000 for it," he said, pulling a wad of cash from his pocket as he reached to pry the ring from her finger. Her defiance was not a shout, but a sharp, silent intake of breath, her body rigid with a lifetime of swallowed injustices. Her quiet refusal hung in the air, a silent challenge that would echo far beyond these walls. What happened in the next 60 seconds would unravel a 20-year-old secret, and if you watch until the end, you will understand the price of history. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Alara was 28, though the weariness in her eyes belonged to someone much older. She had been a waitress at the Gilded Steer for 6 years, a tenure that felt more like a sentence. Each night was a performance of deference and efficiency, a careful dance of balancing plates and egos. Her dignity was a quiet, internal flame she guarded fiercely against the condescending glances and casual cruelties of the city's elite. She was profoundly lonely, a solitary figure navigating a world that saw her only for her function. Her life was a series of silent calculations: how to make her tips stretch to cover rent, how to deflect unwanted advances without losing her job, and how to keep the ghosts of her past from consuming the fragile peace of her present. She existed on the periphery of wealth and power, a constant, humbling reminder of the chasm between their world and hers. The forces keeping her tethered to this life were invisible but unyielding. The lingering medical debts from her mother's illness were a chain around her ankle, a constant drain on her meager income. Her manager, a man whose smiles were as greasy as the kitchen floors, watched her with a proprietary air that made her skin crawl. He held the power to alter her shifts, to cut her hours, to make her life a living hell with a single decision, and they both knew it. Her small apartment, with its view of a brick wall and the constant siren song of the city, was both a sanctuary and a cage. This suffocating reality stood in stark contrast to the effortless luxury she served every night, a world of diamond cufflinks and casual cruelties, where men like the mogul could attempt to buy a piece of her soul as easily as they ordered another bottle of wine. The atmosphere of the restaurant was a sensory assault, designed to soothe the powerful and intimidate the serving. Polished mahogany absorbed the low, golden light, reflecting distorted images of patrons and staff alike. Alara often caught her own fleeting reflection in the gleaming surface of a wine cooler, a pale, serious face with eyes that held too much history. The air was thick with the smells of seared steak, aged scotch, and expensive perfume, a combination that she now associated with anxiety. The soft jazz that filtered through hidden speakers was meant to be sophisticated, but to her, it was a monotonous soundtrack to her entrapment. Each sound, from the heavy thud of the kitchen door to the hushed laughter from a private booth, was a reminder of her place in this gilded ecosystem, silent, observant, and utterly disposable. That tarnished silver ring was the only thing of value she owned, though its worth could never be measured in dollars. It was the last tangible piece of her mother, a woman who had taught her that integrity was the one jewel no one could ever take from you. It was a simple band, worn smooth with time, bearing a faint, almost imperceptible crest, a symbol of a family and a life she barely remembered, a life stolen by a brutal act of violence long ago. To Alara, the ring was an anchor. It was a silent promise to a ghost, a commitment to honor a past she couldn't fully grasp. When the mogul had reached for it, He wasn't just grabbing a piece of metal. He was attempting to desecrate a sacred memory, to violate the one part of her that remained untouched by the world's grime. Her defiance was not a choice. It was an instinct, a defense of her very soul. After the mogul's humiliating retreat, a strange and unfamiliar tension settled over the room. The usual hum of conversation seemed to dip, the air growing heavy and charged. Alara could feel the shift, a prickling on the back of her neck that signaled she was being watched. It was not the leering, dismissive gaze of patrons or the scrutinizing eye of her manager. This was different. It was a focused, unnerving stillness emanating from the darkest corner of the dining room, a place shrouded in deliberate shadow. The gaze was heavy, analytical, and it seemed to see right through the practiced composure of her uniform, past the weary waitress, and into the frightened, resilient woman beneath. It was the kind of attention that did not seek to consume, but to understand, and that was somehow far more terrifying than any open aggression. As she stood at the service station, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly while she polished a wine glass, she dared a quick glance toward the source of the pressure. She could not make out a face, only the sharp, imposing silhouette of a man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He was perfectly still, a predator at rest, his presence a void of silence in the noisy room. The ambient jazz music seemed to falter, holding a single, mournful note that hung in the air like a premonition. The predictable rhythm of her night had been irrevocably broken. A single, invisible thread of fate had been pulled, and though she could not yet comprehend its meaning, she knew with a chilling certainty that her carefully constructed world of silent survival was about to be torn apart. Her manager, Mr. Davies, approached not with concern, but with a thinly veiled annoyance that curdled the air. His smile was a tight, unpleasant line. He saw the incident not as an assault on her dignity, but as a disruption to the restaurant's seamless illusion of tranquility. He adjusted his tie, his eyes avoiding hers, as he spoke in a low, clipped tone about maintaining decorum and not provoking the clientele. The implication was clear. Her quiet defiance was the problem, not the mogul's aggression. Alara simply nodded, her throat too tight to form a reply. She felt the familiar sting of injustice, the cold realization that in this world, her integrity was a liability. Her value was measured only by her ability to remain silent, to absorb the casual cruelties of the powerful and present a placid, untroubled surface. The journey home on the C-22 bus was a descent from one reality into another. She traded the scent of aged leather and expensive cologne for the smell of damp wool and exhaust fumes. The golden, curated light of the steakhouse was replaced by the flickering, sterile fluorescence of the bus, which cast long, tired shadows on the faces of her fellow passengers. Each of them was locked in a private struggle, staring out at the rain-streaked streets of Chicago with a shared, unspoken weariness. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the city's opulent towers blur into streaks of distant, unattainable light. Her uniform, once a shield of professional anonymity, now felt like a costume, a stark reminder of the role she was forced to play in a life that felt increasingly alien to her own soul. Her third-floor walk-up was less a home than a quiet, shadowed space to catch her breath. It was sparse and meticulously clean, an attempt to impose order on a life that felt perpetually chaotic. A single, resilient succulent sat on the windowsill, its stubborn green, a small act of defiance against the oppressive view of a grimy brick wall. On the small kitchen counter, a stack of envelopes with red-lettered warnings sat like a monument to her financial anxieties. The only sound was the slow, deliberate tick of a simple wall clock, each second a heavy drop into an ocean of solitude. This was her sanctuary and her cage, the place where she could finally let the mask slip and confront the silent, overwhelming weight of her own existence, a weight she carried with a grace no one ever saw. That weight was forged in the sterile, antiseptic halls of a hospital ward years ago. Her mother's long illness had not only stolen the most important person in her life, but had also left behind a crippling legacy of debt. The tarnished silver ring was a relic of that love, The threatening letters on her counter were its bitter inheritance. Every double shift she worked, every condescending remark she endured, was a payment made toward a ghost. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would trace the faint crest on the ring with her thumb and try to recall her mother's voice, but the memory was fading, worn away by time and exhaustion. The ring was her last, fragile connection to a past she barely understood and a promise to a future her mother would never see. In the quiet hours before sleep, Alara allowed herself to dream. She kept a small, hidden collection of old architecture books, their pages filled with designs of structures built to last for centuries, elegant, balanced, and full of light. She would trace the lines of blueprints and imagine creating spaces of beauty and peace, a world away from the transient, oppressive luxury of the steakhouse. It was a secret, silent rebellion, a life lived entirely within the confines of her own mind. This internal world was where her true self resided, a woman who craved order, purpose, and the chance to build something meaningful. But each morning, the dream would recede with the dawn, and the reality of her life would reassert itself, forcing her to put on the uniform and fight for simple survival. The next day began, as all the others did, with the shrill cry of her alarm clock in the pre-dawn darkness. The routine was a familiar, soul-numbing ballet of movements. The starchy black uniform felt like a second skin of servitude, its fabric holding the faint, lingering scent of yesterday's stress. As she rode the bus, the city awakened around her, a great, indifferent machine of commerce and power. She watched people in expensive cars and tailored suits rush toward lives of purpose and influence, while she felt like a ghost haunting the margins. The clock at the restaurant seemed to move with agonizing slowness, each minute an eternity, each table a new test of her resolve. Her existence felt cyclical and inescapable, a constant effort to keep her head above water, while the tide of a life she never chose threatened to pull her under. Upon her arrival, Mr. Davies was waiting, his posture radiating a petty authority. He called her into his small, cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee. He didn't mention the incident from the night before directly. Instead, he spoke of, quote, consistency and team players, his words a thinly veiled warning. He informed her that a less desirable, more demanding section of the restaurant was now her responsibility, a clear punishment for the disruption she had supposedly caused. The injustice was so blatant it was almost absurd, a clear demonstration of his power over her. She accepted the demotion with a quiet nod, her silence a strategic retreat, not a surrender. She knew that any protest would only give him the satisfaction he craved and jeopardize the job she desperately needed. Later that evening, in her new, less trafficked section, she observed a young couple on what was clearly a first date, their nervous energy, a stark contrast to the jaded patrons around them. When their bill arrived, she noticed they had been accidentally overcharged for a bottle of wine. For a moment, she hesitated, Mr. Davies's warning echoing in her ears. Doing the right thing could be seen as another disruption. But then she met the young woman's hopeful, anxious eyes, and her own moral compass locked into place. She discreetly approached their table, apologized for the system error, and returned with a corrected bill. The couple's relief was palpable, and for a fleeting moment, Ilara felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with her tips. The end of her shift was met with a cold, persistent drizzle that matched the gloom in her soul. She pulled her thin coat tighter, hurrying down the service alley behind the restaurant, a shortcut she took every night. The alley was poorly lit, filled with looming dumpsters and the slick, dark sheen of wet pavement. Tonight, however, the familiar shadows felt different, more menacing. A primal instinct, honed by years of navigating the city alone, made the hair on her arms stand on end. She quickened her pace, her keys clutched in her fist, the sound of her own footsteps echoing unnervingly off the wet brick walls. She felt a presence before she saw it, a shift in the air that told her she was no longer alone. He stepped out from behind a large waste container, blocking her path. It was the mogul from the night before, his face a mask of smug arrogance, flanked by two other men, whose silence was more threatening than any weapon. He wasn't drunk this time. His eyes were cold and clear with intent. "We didn't get to finish our conversation," he said, his voice a low sneer that cut through the sound of the rain. He took a slow step forward, cornering her against the cold, damp wall. He wasn't interested in the ring anymore. This was about power, about putting the invisible waitress back in her place. As his hand reached, not for her finger, but for her shoulder, a raw, paralyzing fear seized her. She was trapped, her silent world finally collapsing into concrete danger. Just as the mogul's fingers brushed her coat, a sound cut through the alley's oppressive quiet. Not a shout, but the whisper-soft purr of a high-performance engine. A long, black sedan, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the city's distant, bleeding lights, had glided to a silent stop at the mouth of the alley. Its headlights sliced through the rain, casting the three men in a harsh, theatrical glare and throwing their shadows, monstrous and distorted, against the brick wall behind Alara. The sudden intrusion was so quiet, so deliberate, it felt more like a scene from a film than a moment of reality. The mogul and his companions froze, their aggression instantly replaced by a primal, uncertain fear. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The rear door opened with a quiet, expensive click. A man emerged, not with a rush of aggression, but with a measured, almost serene calm that was far more terrifying. He was tall, his form defined by a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness. Rain fell around him, but appeared hesitant to touch the fine wool of his overcoat. His face was a study in controlled stillness, handsome but severe, with eyes that held the cold, ancient weight of a frozen lake. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of immense, contained power. He was not merely a man entering a scene. He was the center of gravity, and the entire alley seemed to bend toward his silent, imposing presence. His name was Marcello Volpe, a name spoken in hushed tones in the city's most powerful circles, and in fearful whispers in its darkest corners. He was a phantom of the old world, a man who operated by a code of honor so rigid and unforgiving that it was a weapon in itself. He was preceded not by noise, but by a chilling silence that commanded more respect than any army. As he stepped fully into the light, two other men, equally silent and dressed in black, materialized from the shadows to stand slightly behind him, their posture a testament to unwavering loyalty. They were his instruments, but he was the will, the mind, and the memory of a criminal empire built on secrets and blood. The mogul's face, which had been a mask of cruel amusement seconds before, was now ashen. A flicker of recognition, followed by pure, unadulterated terror, flashed in his eyes. He took an involuntary step back, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He knew who this was. Everyone who mattered in Chicago knew. Marcello Volpe did not involve himself in petty street-level disputes. His presence here was a catastrophic miscalculation on the mogul's part. The air grew thick with unspoken history, with the knowledge of what this man was capable of. The mogul's two companions seemed to shrink, their physical bulk rendered meaningless by the sheer force of Marcello's reputation. Marcello did not look at the men. His gaze was fixed on Alara, a steady, analytical look that seemed to peel away the layers of her fear and exhaustion, searching for something deeper. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to his right. It was not a command, but a conclusion. His two men stepped forward, their movements fluid and silent. They did not touch the mogul. They simply stood before him, their presence an insurmountable wall. The message was clear, absolute, and required no words. The mogul stammered a frantic, incoherent apology, his arrogance shattered, before he and his men practically scrambled over each other to retreat into the rainy darkness, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The alley was suddenly, profoundly silent, the only sound the gentle patter of rain on the pavement. Marcello Volpe stood before her, the space between them charged with an energy that was both terrifying and strangely protective. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden quiet. She remained pressed against the cold, damp brick, unable to move, unable to look away from the man who had just saved her. He was an enigma of shadows and power, a figure from a world she had only ever served from a distance. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now threaded with something else. a disorienting, unwilling flicker of fascination. He took 2 slow steps closer, his movements deliberate, his gaze never leaving her. His eyes, she now saw, were not just cold. They held a deep, ancient sorrow, a weariness that seemed at odds with his immense power. His attention finally dropped from her face to her hand, which was still clenched at her side. He was not looking at her, but at the tarnished silver ring on her finger, the object that had started this entire confrontation. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, quiet rumble, like distant thunder. "A man who doesn't respect history," he said, the words cutting through the night, "has no future." His tone held no judgment, only the weight of an indisputable truth. The sound of his voice, so calm and controlled, broke through her paralysis. Shaken but finding a sliver of her innate resilience, she met his intense gaze. Her own voice was barely a whisper, fragile but clear against the sound of the rain. "This ring, it was my mother's." As the words left her lips, she saw a change in him. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift, but it was there. His body went rigid, his expression freezing over as his eyes locked onto the faint, worn crest on the silver. A flicker of something, shock, recognition, a pain so deep it was startling, crossed his features before being locked away behind his mask of control. In that instant, he was no longer just a powerful man, he was a man confronting a ghost. He recognized the sigil of the Fontana family. He had not seen it in 20 years, not since the night he had dismantled their rival dynasty in a storm of fire and betrayal. For 2 decades, he had been haunted by the one loose end, the one act for which he could find no absolution. The disappearance of the Fontana heir, a young girl presumed to have died in the chaos. It was a secret penance, a debt of honor he carried in the deepest, most guarded part of his soul. He had searched for her, discreetly and relentlessly, never believing he would find her. Now, standing before him in a waitress uniform, was the ghost of his greatest sin, and perhaps his only chance at a redemption he never thought he deserved. He said nothing more. The silence stretched, thick, with a history only he understood. He simply stared at the ring, then back at her face, his expression an unreadable mix of calculation and profound, hidden turmoil. Then, with the same deliberate grace, he turned and walked back toward his car. One of his men stepped forward and opened the rear door of the sedan, not for Marcello, but for her. It was an invitation that felt like a decree, a silent offer of protection that was also, undoubtedly, a cage. He got into the front passenger seat without a backward glance, leaving her alone in the rain with a choice that was not a choice at all. The echo of his presence remained, a promise of danger and a hint of salvation that would follow her long into the night. The ride in the black sedan was a journey into another dimension. The world outside, with its familiar rain-slicked streets and neon signs, blurred into an abstract watercolor painting. Inside, there was only a profound, insulated silence. The air smelled of aged leather and something clean and metallic, a scent of contained power that was utterly foreign to her. Ilara sat stiffly on the plush seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the tarnished silver of her ring, a cold point of contact with her own reality. Marcello Volpi sat in the front, a silent silhouette against the city lights. He never looked back, never spoke a word, yet his presence filled the car, a heavy, gravitational force that made it difficult for her to breathe. She was acutely aware of every small detail, the whisper-quiet engine, the seamless glide of the vehicle over potholes, the sheer, unnerving stillness of it all. When the car stopped in front of her modest apartment building, its sleek, predatory form looked grotesquely out of place. Marcello still did not turn. The driver's side door opened, and one of the other men, his face impassive, got out and walked around to open her door. He then escorted her to the building's entrance, his steps silent on the wet pavement. He waited until she had unlocked the main door and was safely inside the dim, linoleum-floored lobby before he turned and retreated back to the waiting vehicle. The gesture was meant to be protective, she knew, but it felt like a transfer of custody. As she climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, she felt his eyes on her back, a phantom weight of surveillance. Her small, quiet sanctuary no longer felt safe. It now felt observed, a fragile island in an ocean of unseen danger. The following day at the Gilded Steer was a study in dissonance. The familiar routine, once a source of numbing comfort, now felt like a charade. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of wealthy patrons, the oppressive jazz music. It all seemed to be part of a set, a flimsy facade for a much darker reality. Every shadow in the restaurant seemed to hold a threat. Every patron in a dark suit made her heart skip a beat. She moved through her shift mechanically, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and a strange, unwelcome curiosity. The image of Marcello's face was seared into her mind. The cold control, the flicker of recognition, the deep, ancient sorrow in his eyes. She was a ghost in her own life, haunted not by the past, but by a present that had been irrevocably altered by a man she knew she should despise. During her break, she sought refuge in a small, nondescript coffee shop 2 blocks away, a place where the powerful never ventured. She sat by the window, nursing a cup of tea, trying to will her world back into its normal, predictable orbit. Then she saw him. He was seated in a secluded booth across the room, partially hidden behind a broadsheet newspaper. It could not be a coincidence. As if sensing her gaze, he slowly lowered the paper, and his eyes met hers across the crowded room. The ambient noise of the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of customers faded into nothing. For a long, breathless moment, there was only the silent, charged connection between them. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of her existence that was both a comfort and a threat, before raising the paper again and disappearing behind it. Ilara felt a war raging within her. One part of her, the part forged by her mother's unwavering moral compass, screamed that this man was a monster, a creature of violence and shadow. He was everything she stood against, the embodiment of the corrupt power she saw every night at the restaurant. Yet, another part of her could not reconcile that image with the man who had looked at her mother's ring with such profound hidden pain. She remembered his quiet authority, the way he had dismantled the mogul's aggression without raising his voice or lifting a hand. It was a terrifying display of power, but it had also been in her defense. This duality confused and frightened her, this growing fascination with the humanity she sensed beneath the cold, dangerous exterior. The next shift, something had changed. Mr. Davies was gone. His greasy smile and leering gaze had vanished from the restaurant. He had been fired, the staff whispered, for managerial discrepancies. The new manager, a crisp, professional woman, treated Ilara with a surprising and almost formal respect. She was quietly reassigned to one of the best sections, her previous demotion erased as if it had never happened. No one said a word, but Ilara knew. She felt it in the marrow of her bones. Marcello Volpe had reached into her life and removed an obstacle with the casual, invisible force of a god. The act was not a kindness. It was a statement. It was a demonstration of his reach, a reminder that he could alter her reality at will, for better or for worse. The cage was becoming more comfortable, but it was still a cage. His presence became a constant, invisible hum in the background of her life. She would catch a glimpse of a black sedan parked down the street from her building late at night, its engine off, a silent sentinel in the darkness. Sometimes, walking home from the bus stop, she would feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a heightened awareness that told her she was being watched, followed by men who were masters of staying unseen. She was no longer just a solitary woman navigating the city. She was a protected asset, a piece on a board she did not understand. The loneliness that had once defined her was replaced by a new, more unsettling solitude, the isolation of being surrounded by unseen guardians, her freedom, a carefully managed illusion. From his office overlooking the Chicago River, Marcello watched the footage from the discreet security cameras he had installed near her apartment. He saw her return home each night, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He saw her tend to the single plant on her windowsill, with a gentle care that seemed to defy the harshness of her world. This woman, this ghost from his past, was a living embodiment of a code he had long since abandoned. Her quiet integrity, her refusal to be broken by a world that had given her nothing but hardship, was a constant, painful reminder of his own corrupted soul. He was drawn to her light not because he wanted to possess it, but because he had forgotten what it felt like. Protecting her had started as a matter of honor, a debt to be paid, but it was slowly becoming an obsession. One evening, as she was leaving the restaurant, he was there. He wasn't in his car, but standing on the sidewalk, the collar of his overcoat turned up against the biting wind. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows around him. He looked less like a crime boss, and more like a solitary figure waiting for a train that would never arrive. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. "You are not safe," he said, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost to the wind. It wasn't a threat or a warning, but a simple, cold statement of fact. It was an acknowledgement of the world he had dragged her into, a world where humiliation was answered not with apologies but with violence. His presence there was an admission of his own culpability in her danger. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her innate defiance rose to meet it. She pulled her thin coat tighter around herself, a futile gesture against the cold and the man in front of her. "Safe from what?" she asked, her voice trembling but holding a note of accusation. "From the consequences of your world, or from you?" He did not flinch. His gaze remained steady, holding a depth of regret she could not begin to comprehend. "There is no difference," he finally answered. He then made an offer, his words precise and devoid of emotion. He wanted her to work for him, managing the accounts for a luxury hotel he owned. A legitimate front, but a front nonetheless. It was a golden key to a gilded cage, an escape from servitude into a more elegant form of imprisonment. As he outlined the offer, his hand moved in a small, illustrative gesture, and for a fleeting second the back of his gloved fingers brushed against her own. The contact was accidental, minimal, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity through her. It was as if a live wire had touched her skin, a sudden, shocking intimacy in the cold night air. The world seemed to stop, the sound of the wind and the distant traffic falling away. They both recoiled instantly, their eyes locking in a moment of shared, startled awareness. The air between them was suddenly thick with unspoken things, with a tension that was no longer just about power and fear, but something far more personal and dangerous. In that single, accidental touch, the carefully constructed walls between them had been breached. She found her voice, though it felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "I can't," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Accepting his offer would mean accepting his world, becoming a part of the darkness she had always fought to keep at bay. It would be a betrayal of her mother's memory, a violation of the very moral code that defined her. She had to refuse, even if it meant remaining vulnerable, even if it meant facing the unknown dangers alone. Turning away from him was one of the hardest things she had ever done. She walked down the street without looking back, each step feeling heavier than the last, acutely aware of his gaze following her, until she turned the corner and was swallowed by the city's shadows. Marcello watched her go, a strange and unfamiliar mix of frustration and admiration stirring within him. In his world, no one refused him. People begged for his favor, for the kind of opportunity he had just offered her. Her rejection was not an insult. It was a testament to her strength, a quality he recognized as the core of the Fontana legacy. This quiet, resilient woman possessed a form of power he could not buy, command, or intimidate. Her integrity was a fortress, and he found himself inexplicably drawn to it, even as it stood as a barrier between them. Her refusal didn't push him away. It solidified his resolve. She was worthy of his protection not just because of her name, but because of who she was. The consequences of her defiance came swiftly. 2 nights later, she arrived home to find a small, gruesome package on her doormat. It was a dead sparrow, its neck broken, a crude and visceral message from the real estate mogul, a man too cowardly to face Marcello but arrogant enough to terrorize a woman he thought was alone. A wave of nausea and pure, unadulterated terror washed over her. This was not the abstract danger of a powerful man's presence. This was a concrete, violent threat brought to her doorstep. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The thin walls of her apartment no longer felt like a sanctuary. She was completely, terrifyingly exposed, and the moral high ground she had fought so hard to maintain suddenly felt like a very foolish and lonely place to be. The knock on her door came less than an hour later. It was not the loud, aggressive bang of a threat, but a quiet, firm rap that resonated with authority. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, who it was. She opened the door on trembling legs. Marcelo stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes were not on her, but on the small, pathetic bundle on her mat. He had seen it. Of course, he had seen it. His surveillance was absolute. He looked from the dead bird to her face, taking in her pale skin and the raw terror in her eyes. In that moment, the carefully controlled mask he always wore seemed to crack, revealing a glimpse of a raw, protective rage that was more frightening than his coldness. Without a word, he stepped past her, crossing the threshold into her small, meticulously kept apartment. His large frame seemed to consume all the available space, his dark, expensive suit, a stark and menacing contrast to her simple, worn furniture. The air grew thick, charged with his silent fury. He ignored her, his attention drawn to the small stack of architecture books on her bookshelf. He picked one up, his gloved fingers tracing the elegant lines of a cathedral blueprint on the cover. "Some things," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers, "are built to protect what is sacred." He closed the book with a soft, final thud. "I will not let them touch you." It was not a reassurance. It was a vow of impending violence. His promise hung in the air of her small apartment, a vow of violence made on her behalf that was both terrifying and absolute. He turned from her, pulling a sleek, dark phone from his coat pocket. He made a call, and the language he spoke was not English, but a fluid, guttural Italian that sounded like sharpened stones. His voice was low, devoid of emotion, yet every syllable carried the weight of a death sentence. Ilara stood frozen by her bookshelf, a spectator to the mobilization of a dark and powerful world she had only ever glimpsed from the periphery. He was a storm contained within the four walls of her life, and she could feel the barometric pressure dropping, the air growing thin and electric with the promise of his wrath. She was no longer just afraid of what others might do to her, she was terrified of what he would do for her. The call ended with a soft, final click. He turned back to her, the cold fury in his eyes replaced by a hard, impenetrable resolve. "You cannot stay here," he stated, the words leaving no room for argument. It was not a suggestion or an offer of help. It was a command, a transfer of her safety from her own hands into his. Ilara's entire life had been governed by a single, unwavering principle: never be indebted, never surrender her independence. Now, faced with the visceral proof of her vulnerability, the memory of the dead bird, the cold dread still coiling in her gut, her principles felt like a flimsy shield against an invading army. The desire to refuse, to cling to the last vestiges of her autonomy, warred with a primal, overwhelming need to be safe. In her silence, she surrendered. He led her from the building, his hand hovering an inch from the small of her back, a gesture of proprietary protection that did not touch her skin, but branded her all the same. The ride in the sedan was shrouded in a different kind of silence this time, one filled not with tension, but with the irrevocable weight of his decision and her compliance. The city lights streamed past the tinted windows, a world she no longer fully belonged to. She watched his reflection in the glass, the hard, stoic lines of his profile, and for the first time, she saw beyond the monster. She saw a man bound by a rigid ancient code, a code of honor and violence that she could not comprehend, and she knew with a chilling certainty that in protecting her, he was somehow violating its most sacred tenets. They did not go to a hotel. The car glided through a set of imposing iron gates and down a long, tree-lined drive, stopping before a sprawling stone mansion that seemed to rise from the shores of Lake Michigan like a fortress. It was a place of immense wealth, profound isolation, and deep shadows. This was his home. Bringing her here was a transgression she could feel in the very stillness of the air. This was a sanctuary, a place where the darkness of his world was kept at bay, and by allowing her to cross its threshold, he was exposing a vulnerability he had likely guarded for his entire life. The grand foyer was silent, smelling of old leather, wood smoke, and rain, the scent of a solitude far deeper and more permanent than her own. He led her into a cavernous library, where a fire crackled and a hearth large enough to stand in. He moved to a small bar, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid without asking. He handed one to her, and she took it, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. The contact was a spark in the cold, quiet room. This was her moment, her one chance to demand a truth from a man who lived behind walls of silence. Her own transgression was to break that silence, to refuse to be a passive piece in his game. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady, refusing to break under the weight of his gaze. "Why are you doing this for me?" The question hung between them, a fragile challenge in the heart of his fortress. He turned to face the fire, the dancing flames casting his face in a mask of flickering light and shadow. 20 years ago, he began, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, heavy with the dust of memory. "I made a promise to a dying man that I would find a ghost." He spoke of a war between families, not in terms of power or territory, but in terms of tragedy and loss. He spoke of the Fontana family, of a rival dynasty he had been ordered to dismantle, and of the chaos of a single violent night that had ended an entire bloodline. He described the crest, the symbol on her ring, as the last sigil of a fallen house, and confessed that his greatest failure had been the one life he could never account for in the aftermath, that of a young, lost daughter. The story landed not as an explanation, but as a physical blow. The fractured, nightmarish memories she had of her parents, deaths, the screech of tires, the shattering glass, the wail of sirens, snapped into a horrifying, unbearable focus. They were not the victims of a random car accident, as she had been told. They were collateral damage in his world. Her entire life, her loneliness, her struggle, had been forged in the crucible of his war. The man standing before her, the man who had appointed himself her protector, was the architect of her orphanhood. The room tilted, the air growing thick and unbreathable. The whiskey glass slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the hearthstone with a sound that echoed the breaking of her world. The sharp crack of the glass broke through his stoic control. He spun around, his face a canvas of raw, unguarded guilt. He saw not just the shock on her face, but the ghost of the terrified child she had been, a child his actions had created. He crossed the space between them in 2 long, urgent strides. He reached for her, not with gentleness, but with a desperate, anchoring force. His hands gripped her upper arms, his hold firm, grounding them both in the wreckage of his confession. "I did not kill them," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all its authority, and left with only a ragged, profound pain. "But my world did. There is no absolution for that. I have lived with their faces in the dark every night for 20 years. She looked up into his eyes and saw the truth of his words. The cold, impenetrable mask was gone, and in its place was a landscape of torment. She saw the decades of self-imposed penance, the crushing weight of a debt he believed he could never repay, the profound loneliness of a man imprisoned by his own sins. The monster vanished, replaced by a man drowning. Her fear, the terror that had been her constant companion, dissolved into a wave of aching, impossibly complex empathy. She did not fight his grip or pull away. Instead, her own trembling hands rose to rest on his forearms. It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was a silent, mutual acknowledgement of a shared, inescapable wound. The moment stretched, suspended in the warm, flickering firelight, the world outside falling away. The storm of his confession and her grief receded, leaving a profound, irrevocably altered silence in its wake. They slowly, reluctantly, released their hold, and the space between them was no longer a battlefield, but a fragile, hallowed ground. The shattered glass glittering on the stone floor was a perfect monument to their pasts, now laid bare and broken between them. He had broken his code of silence and secrecy. She had broken her code of moral certainty. They were no longer a mafia don and a waitress. They were 2 survivors of the same defining tragedy, bound together by a history that had finally, violently, caught up to them both. The dawn that followed his confession was cold and gray, the light filtering through the immense library windows and laying a sterile film over the rich mahogany and leather-bound books. Ilara awoke in a guest suite so vast and impersonal, it felt more like a room in a museum than a place for a living person. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. She stood at the window, looking out at the turbulent, slate-colored waters of Lake Michigan, a perfect mirror for the turmoil inside her. The previous night's revelation had not brought clarity, only a deeper, more complex pain. He had given her the missing piece of her history, but in doing so, he had shattered the very foundation of her identity. The man who protected her was the shadow that had haunted her entire life, and the weight of that truth was a solitude more profound than any she had ever known. He found her in the breakfast room, a sun-drenched space that felt mockingly cheerful. Martello's mask of stoic control was perfectly restored, his expression unreadable, his dark suit a piece of impenetrable armor. He moved with a formal, deliberate distance, as if the raw, unguarded man from the night before had been a figment of her imagination. He explained the new reality in a low, clipped tone that left no room for discussion. She was to remain in the house, where she would be safe. His staff would see to her every need. But their interactions, he made clear, would be minimal. It was for her protection, he said, a statement that felt both true and like a profound betrayal. He was locking her away, not just from the world, but from himself, retreating behind the very walls he had momentarily let crumble. The confession had been a breach. This was the fortification. The first tangible consequence of his protection arrived not as a threat, but as a headline on the television playing silently in the corner of the grand living room. She was passing through when a local news anchor's somber face caught her eye. The real estate mogul, the man who had started it all, had vanished. His car was found abandoned near a desolate industrial pier. Police suspected foul play. The anchor's words were clinical, but Ilara felt them like a physical blow. A man was gone, erased from the world, and it was because of her, because of a tarnished silver ring and a quiet act of defiance. The violence done in her name, without her consent, was a stain that seeped into her soul. She was no longer just a victim of his world. She was now a beneficiary of its brutal justice, and that complicity was a heavier burden than any fear she had ever carried. Her days in the mansion bled into one another, a monotonous rhythm of opulent silence. The gilded cage was beautiful, filled with priceless art and books that smelled of history, but it was a prison nonetheless. She would wander the long, echoing corridors, her footsteps a lonely sound on the polished marble floors, feeling like a ghost haunting someone else's life. From a tall, arched window in the West Wing, she could see the distant Chicago skyline, a collection of glittering spires that represented a world she could no longer access. The city, once her oppressor, now seemed like a lost paradise of simple, anonymous freedom. Time was marked only by the slow, deliberate tick of a grandfather clock in the foyer, each chime a reminder of a life suspended, a future held captive by the past. Marcello was a phantom in his own home. She would hear the distant rumble of his car returning late at night, or catch a fleeting glimpse of his silhouette passing the end of a long hallway. He was consumed by the fallout, retreating into the dark heart of his empire to manage the ripples his actions had caused. Protecting her, bringing her into his sanctuary, had been a flagrant breach of his own unwritten laws. It was a declaration of a personal stake, a perceived weakness his rivals would be eager to test. He immersed himself in meetings with men whose faces were as hard and unforgiving as the city's winter, fighting a war to maintain the brutal order of his world while simultaneously battling the profound disorder she had brought into his soul. His distance was not just for her safety, it was for his own survival. The initial shock and paralyzing grief began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp lucidity. The pain did not lessen, but it transformed. Ilara began to see the intricate, tragic architecture of her situation with an unnerving clarity. Martello was not a simple monster, nor was he a tragic hero. He was a man forged by a violent world, bound by a code she was only beginning to understand. She spent her days in his library, not just reading novels to escape, but devouring books on history, art, and strategy. She was no longer the passive waitress reacting to events. She was becoming an observer, a student of the power that now surrounded her, learning the language of the shadows. Her vulnerability was hardening into a quiet, observant strength. Her mother's resilience, finally taking root in the barren soil of her new reality. They passed each other once, in a long, sun-drenched corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. For a single, breathless moment, the world stopped. He was on his way out, she on her way to the library. They paused, the 10 feet of polished marble between them feeling like an impassable chasm. No words were spoken, but their eyes met, and in that silent, fleeting glance, an entire conversation took place. She saw the crushing weight of his guilt and the profound loneliness of his self-imposed exile. He saw the pain in her eyes, but also a new, unyielding strength that had not been there before. It was a moment of pure, agonizing connection, a shared acknowledgement of their impossible bond, before he gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod and continued on his way, leaving only the echo of his presence in the silent hall. The true nature of the danger became clearer one afternoon, not from Marcello, but from Sophia, the elderly housekeeper who moved through the mansion with a quiet, knowing grace. While delivering fresh linens, the woman paused, her kind, wrinkled face etched with concern. She spoke in a hushed tone of hushed phone calls, of new names being whispered with venom by Marcello's men. Rival families, she explained, had taken notice of the Fontana ghost. They didn't see a woman to be protected. They saw a loose thread from the past, an emotional liability, a weakness in the impenetrable armor of Don Volpe. Ilara understood then that her safety was not a given. Her very existence in his life was a provocation, a beacon that was drawing the attention of sharks who smelled blood in the water. She was not just his greatest secret, she was his most profound vulnerability. A quiet resolve settled over her. Staring out at the city from her window, she realized the fundamental flaw in his plan. True safety could never be found within these stone walls. This mansion was not a shield, it was a target, and her presence within it endangered him as much as it protected her. To stay would be to accept a life defined by his violence, to allow her soul to be slowly eroded by the gilded comfort of her cage. To leave would be to step back into a world of tangible threats, but it would be on her own terms, guided by her own moral compass. The pain of her past had not broken her. It had forged her. Her mother's ring was not just a symbol of loss, but of integrity. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating, that she had to walk away. That night, as a storm broke over the lake, she stood before the same towering window, watching lightning illuminate the churning black water. The rain lashed against the thick glass, each drop a tiny, frantic heartbeat against the profound silence of the house. She pressed her palm against the cold pane, feeling the distant vibration of the thunder. The silver ring on her finger was a familiar, solid weight, an anchor in the storm, inside and out. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the deafening echo of all the things that had been left unsaid between them, a long, mournful note of grief, guilt, and a connection that could never be. It was the sound of an ending, and in that sound, she found the strength to choose her own beginning. She left before dawn, while the mansion was still shrouded in a pre-light mist that clung to the cold stone. She didn't take anything with her, not a single piece of the opulent comfort that had been her prison. On the polished mahogany of the library table, in the exact spot where the whiskey glass had shattered, she placed the tarnished silver ring. This was not an act of rejection, but of release. Leaving it behind was a quiet, firm declaration that she was no longer the Fontana ghost or the object of his penance. She was, finally and completely, just Ilara. As she walked down the long, silent driveway, the iron gates closing behind her with a soft, final click, she did not feel fear. For the first time since childhood, she felt the quiet, terrifying, and exhilarating burden of her own freedom, stepping back into the world not as a victim, but as an architect of her own fate. Marcello found the ring hours later, a small, lonely circle of silver in the vast, empty room. The house, which had always been silent, now felt profoundly hollow, its quiet echoing with the ghost of her integrity. He picked it up, the cool metal, a familiar weight in his palm. He understood. Her departure was not an escape. It was a judgment. She had shown him that true protection was not about walls and guards, but about respecting someone's right to build a life of their own, even if it was a life without him. He closed his hand around the ring, the worn crest pressing into his skin. This, he realized, was the true cost of his absolution. Not to possess the ghost of his past, but to finally, completely, let her go. His penance would now be a lifetime of respectful, invisible distance, the quiet guardianship of a man who had learned the difference between owning and honoring. 2 years passed, marked not by the ticking of a grandfather clock, but by the turning pages of textbooks and the scratch of a graphite pencil on drafting paper. Elara had enrolled in the city's architecture program, funding her education with scholarships and late-night work at a quiet diner far from the city's opulent center. She traded the weight of serving platters for the weight of her own ambition. Her exhaustion was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a testament to her progress. The small apartment she now rented had a window that overlooked not a brick wall, but a small city park filled with the sound of children playing. She was building, line by line, a future of light and structure, a world of her own design, far from the shadows that had once threatened to consume her, and everything she held dear. The dedication of the Northwood Community Library was a modest affair, a small victory of civic pride in a forgotten neighborhood. It was her first completed project, a design born from her final thesis. The building was not grand or imposing. It was made of warm wood and wide panes of glass, designed to let the light in. It was a space for quiet dignity, for second chances, for the kind of sanctuary she had once craved. As she stood near the back of the small crowd, listening to the city councilman speak, a profound sense of peace settled over her. She had not just built a structure of brick and glass, she had built a future on the foundations of her own resilience. She had created a place of order and hope, a quiet defiance against a world of chaos, and in doing so, she had finally honored her mother's true legacy. It was then that she felt it, the familiar, unnerving weight of a focused gaze. Her eyes scanned the periphery of the crowd, past the smiling families and local reporters, to a figure standing under the deep shade of an old oak tree across the street. He was a silhouette in a dark overcoat, a man out of place in the afternoon sun, a phantom from another life. It was Marcello. He was not looking at the library. He was looking at her. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that silent, charged moment, the chasm of their two worlds was bridged. He saw the architect, the creator, the woman she had become. She saw the penitent, the guardian, the man who had kept his final, silent promise. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before turning and melting back into the city's indifferent shadows, a ghost returning to his haunting. A soft breeze rustled the newly planted trees around the library. Elara did not watch him leave. She looked at the building, at the children already running through its open doors, their laughter, a sound of pure, unadulterated hope. She instinctively touched the bare skin of her finger, feeling not an absence, but a sense of completion. Some histories are not meant to be erased, but to be built upon with strength and light. If this story of impossible connection and quiet redemption moved you, show your support by liking and sharing this video, and let us know in the comments what it means to build a new future from a broken past. Your engagement helps us create more stories that find humanity in the deepest shadows. He had given her back her history, but she had claimed her own future.